smiling to ourselves because my son, who's the cameraman, has been waiting for us to stop gas bagging so we could start gas bagging. We just haven't seen each other for a little while, and there's so much to talk about. We just worked out 2004 was when we first crossed paths?
Yes, about 2004. And I remember you coming to our first meeting. It was Community Action for Prevention of Suicide group. Yeah. That's when you came in, and I just went, the kind of, the room just stopped, and you had this presence going through. And I'll never forget it because as much as you were beautiful in gracing the room, that you were beautiful, what you were talking about, and everyone just stopped. And I remember from that point on, and I think Jodie was there too, there were a couple of other people, and and it made, to be honest, the whole conversation about community action towards preventing suicide real in that moment, because we were very much, at that point in time, I think just in the whole sector, there wasn't a massive acceptance towards lived experience. Perhaps in the mental health sector, there was kind of underground work being done in the workforce, etc. But for suicide, to have that level of input, it wasn't a thing, it wasn't accepted at the time. So I remember going, oh my goodness, this woman's divine. Yeah.
Wow, because I remember, for those that don't know much about my work, I wrote my first book in 2000, and I've written 6 books since, but my work is very much lived experience because I'm a recovering addict. I was a suicidal teen, domestic violence, sexual abuse, all that sort of stuff. So I remember standing in the car park, can I tell you, to get the invitation to come to Griffith Uni with all these clever people, and to actually, and for me, the passion of being able to regurgitate stuff that helped me get off the floor in a psych ward because of my chronic post-traumatic stress, and feel that I had value. People like yourself and Professor John Saunders and Diego De Leo and some amazing people that are academics and leaders in the field that have invited me to come in. So I remember palpitating before I went in, walking into that room and thinking, well, all I can do is be me, because I can't meet them on an academic level, but they've asked me to come and sit at the table for my lived experience. So thank you for that, because I had no idea. I just thought you would have seen me shaking.
No, and we wouldn't have even begun to imagine that's what you would have been feeling, because I think you hit a really important point, because we're all academics, but there's no real status. So there may be a perceived status in the community. Academic doesn't mean we're all these human beings at one level. And so I think more than ever, it's hard to convey the fact that whilst there are these structures in society, particularly in university settings or government, whatever, that sort of seem to segregate status, they're just superficial. So I remember thinking, wow, you are this person who's become completely raw, exposing this stuff, which all of us have to a certain extent, right? Everyone has their own little baggage, of course, but so often we live our lives hidden behind the little label, professor or whatever, and those titles, and just because of how things happen, that's how you tend to your identity. Work identity is such a big part of your life, so you kind of manage to get around. It's kind of like a little scaffold in a way, to some extent. So I think everyone has that, but to see you then go out and talk about it, and like it was such a core part of your identity, like this is who I am. And that's, I think, what made us go, oh, this is like, I know you wouldn't have known this. We're going like, oh, that's Cynthia. So you wouldn't have known that, but that was that big level of just being authentic about all that stuff, I think, is what a lot of people would in fact like to be like.
Well, thank you for that, because I must say I feel the same way when I have a client come through the door, whether it's a huge football player that takes up the whole door frame, or, a soldier from the Defence Forces that I know is being incredibly courageous. And when they actually take off their armour and start to talk about what's going on in their heart, I too, it's a sacred honour to be around people that are, perhaps for the first time, or trying really hard to make something useful of something that was really hard. So, I mean, that's really lovely to hear that. And I think, the what's not often understood because of trauma, what happens, well, for me, I finished school at 14, and I know for many people that have a reluctance to come and see a clinician. Some of that is, and I understand, you know, what you're sort of saying from where you sit, it feels like scaffolding, but for a non-academic person, and I remember my psychiatrist saying to me after he sort of got me out of a psych ward and said, you know, you're not crazy, you're not bipolar, you're not manic depressive, and I'm not going to medicate you, but this is chronic post-traumatic stress, and you need to give me some time. And the fact that he spoke to me in very layman's terms, but I was so reluctant. I had fought because my suicide attempt at 16, when I OD'd in a toilet block after having, you know, a sexual encounter with someone my own age, after having 2 male predators as a little girl, I went into the sewage came flooding through. I thought, I can't do this. And the thought of ODing, which is what I did, and I remember looking into my eyes as I did it, and then being fetal around, and I literally, as a little girl after trauma, I would hug trees. I literally would coil myself around the base of a tree and hold on. And it was a meditative thing I was doing because I didn't know what else to do. And I remember coiling myself around this toilet and holding on and literally like waiting, because I honestly believe in the fairies and the stars. I mean, there's always fairy lights and colour and nature. And as a little girl, there was a beautiful vine on my back fence that used to, around the tree, I'd lay there and just meditate on it and imagine the fairies coming into it. And it just helps me in a meditative place. And I literally laid around that toilet bowl and waited to be beamed up, feeling relief because I had no tools for this sewerage. And then when I woke up in intensive care and then, you know, later on being told, and just felt crazy. And my girlfriends that were going on to university and that were studying and that could go and have a girls' night, but they would be home by midnight and I'd be trashed somewhere in a bush at 4 a.m, not knowing where my shoes were, just thinking there's something innately wrong with me. I'm broken or I'm flawed. And these people that can be consistent and study and learn. I could do art and English, but for many trauma survivors that might be watching this, we often feel very inferior academically. And so to go and talk to somebody that has all this clinical knowledge and not even know if you can, what I call articulate, that is talk about what's going on in your heart, not just from an act. It's just such a big jump. And meeting people like yourself in the academic field that are actually respectful and see a place for that, that is such a huge jump. And I think this is why I started my lived experience model, because it wasn't until, you know, I was fetal on the floor in my bathtub and then again involuntary put into another psych ward that I surrendered, because I never would have done it because of this whole intimidation and shame around they're just going to lock me up. Because when I was 16, I was put into a psych ward, told I was crazy and told I needed medication, literally. And again, I certainly don't blame the clinicians. I had no language. I certainly wasn't going to talk about it with caregivers around me that didn't know. You know, so I think this whole, and I'm in awe, and I have been gifted with very clever sons, and their father, I think one of the things I liked about him was he was a man of science, but he was a botanist, so he was a man of the flower fairies, you know, so he taught me a lot about science. But I think I find that really admirable, and that's, so yeah, it's a huge hurdle. So I suppose moving forward, it would be really, I don't really kind of know why you got into the field, and I know you're just a very clever woman because I know there's lots and lots of letters after your name. There is.
It's true.
It is. So talk to us about why you got into this field and what was the lure for you?
Interesting. Because you know I've never had this question before at this level. So mostly, if I think back to it, I remember in year 11 and 12 being very interested in psychology. And I don't even know why. Maybe it was a bit because my father was doing kind of social science and psychotherapy. Something, it may have been that, but I remember him doing assignments and stuff as we were older and thinking, oh, that's really interesting. And there was the Freud and there was the Gestalt and there was the... So I remember being quite interested in seeing those books around. But and at first, I got into social science at first rather than psychology. So And back in the time, that was very interesting because it was back in the time of the Fitzgerald inquiry and the Royal Commission into Black Deaths, or they called it Aboriginal deaths, but it was termed at the time Black Deaths.
Aboriginal Black Deaths?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
In
sorry.
custody. Yeah. So they talked about, and that's how it was given terminology. Back then it wasn't such a big thing, the appropriate terminology. And of course today it became, I look back and it became very meaningful for a couple of reasons for me, because we had to learn all these commissioned reports, study them in my social sciences degree, and my part-time work was in juvenile justice. So I worked with, I had 3 little Aboriginal children in John Oxley Youth Detention Centre, 2 of which died by suicide when they were released. And I wasn't told about this. I think one was 14 and one was nearly or around about 16. So so they used to do beautiful art and hand me their artwork, and I really learned about, as fearful as I was going into the prisons, I had to see them in their cells several times before they came out. And I can't even remember the program that I was working on because it was a placement, but I also had to see the Indigenous girls at Windsor. There was a prison, Sir Leslie Wilson, and I remember a couple of football players, I think Scotty Sattler and a couple of others at the time were also working there, and we did have a couple of exchanges of conversations about the horrific stories of these children who ended up in prison by no fault of their own, and intergenerational stuff and trauma, and so obviously, and this was of some interest to me in my choices then.
So how old were you then?
So I would have been 18, 19, 20, around my early, coming into my 20s.
Yep.
But I also worked in a women's refuge with domestic violence. So these 2 jobs will help me get through uni, and it built up my CV a little bit. So I had a lot of exposure to a lot of things that I'd never in my childhood been exposed to. In fact, I had quite the opposite upbringing. So it was, this is not on. This is, how can people grow up without the things that I had? It was hugely, I felt not so much guilty, but it was not fair, not right. And people even my age and little kids, and we have I come from quite a massive family.
How many kids?
So I have 4 brothers, and they each have a few kids. So we have like 13, Mum and Dad have 13 grandchildren.
Oh, God.
But we have quite a massive extended family
sure.
too. So lots of cousins. And yeah, so I grew up with quite, I guess, well-established attachments and lots of love. So when I saw all this sort of stuff, it was just terrible, terrible, terrible. So in any case, and of course at that point I was thinking, quite naive perhaps a little bit, that we can, that I can go in and save the world and, be of assistance to help all these little kids and stuff. In any case, I thought in social work it was difficult. It was very, it was difficult to make a difference, and I thought, and highly disorganised compared to the systems today. I think it was much more difficult back then. And anyway, so I applied for psychology, got into psychology, did my psych studies, and at the same time continued to work in these juvenile justice, etc. In fact, they became my data collection source for my thesis. And I looked at social and emotional loneliness in kids, and I looked at what we called delinquent when you're in juvenile delinquency back then, and I looked at the needs of delinquents versus non-delinquents, on their need for idealising, twinship, belongingness, to test a theoretical model, which was a Freudian-based, or self-psychology, which is a contemporary Freudian-based theoretical proposition about how the sense of self develops.
Sorry to interrupt you. Did you say twinship?
Twinship needs.
Twinship needs.
So it's about needing to be like someone.
So
we all have these. The proposition is Heinz Cahoot is his name. He believes that we all have these 3 needs, and that we depending on how much we've internalised self-object relations, be it negative or positive, that has a big role in determination of how much of that need we need to be met. We could be adults and still have unmet twinship needs, or belongingness needs, or idealising needs.
Can you unpack those a little bit more? So belongingness, self-explanatory, we're hardwired for inclusion, so belonging to a tribe. Yeah. So twinship. So what happens with a child, an only child?
So things like twinship, like say, for example, dad's, I don't know, shaving
Yeah.
away and you're a little kid and you get up on the stool and you get shaving cream and you want to do that as well. So as a little child, you kind of, it can be a merger kind of phenomena of yourself with wanting to be the same as someone. So it's usually the adult figure. Certainly it can be with siblings as well. So,
but if you've got violence happening there, that doesn't ever happen.
It doesn't happen. And it's very, very unlikely that it can. Well, if there's nothing that you adore, admire, etc., that you can twin with, gather your twinship needs from, that can lead you. So you may have this desire as you get older, a higher desire or need for twinship, which is fine, and it's all very idiosyncratic in terms of your little pathway and trajectory towards that self-actualization and all those needs getting met.
Mm-hmm.
And so that allowed me to interview these Indigenous children, and in both prisons as well as on the outside world, and we compared them on these needs. And of course, which kind of validated the theoretical proposition of cahoots, it did confirm that people with, more so for the two idealisation and twinship needs, those in prisons had much lesser of those needs than compared to non-delinquents. So terminology. But
sorry to interrupt you, because does this fit, or am I just not on the same page here? So I notice often when I've also done work in detention centres, and over in New Zealand I did some work with young kids in biker gangs. So is that whole belonging and sort of the tattoos and the tribal, like I belong here?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. For a lot of them, that's how they theoretically you would say. Of course, that validates that whole need, according to Coot, to meet those things.
Okay.
Twinship.
Yeah.
So you can see the purpose behind kids' behaviour, and when they join gangs, so a lot of times these days it's about the need to have funds to support their ice and meth and whatever else habits. But the other very strong component of that is wanting to be like them. And we've known about peer belongingness for a long time, but theoretically, when you try to measure or understand that in a deep way, you put theoretical constructs that might help to measure those things. But certainly it's as a phenomenon, it's very common, and usually common people talk about it in adolescence, but it starts very, very young, in fact. So, so that kind of little part of my journey was I really gained an appreciation for what people's different ways that people can have needs met and not. And then when I was in psychology, the very end of psychology, I did the loneliness, emotional and social loneliness. And then I got a scholarship. The reason I had to leave all that behind, that sort of work, because I worked out bush, got Queensland Health Scholarship, and that was when my suicide prevention career began, because back out there they had no coordinator or person to kind of support suicide prevention education. So I did Graham Martin's Keep Yourself Alive, which, would you believe, this is really interesting, Keep Yourself Alive, and I didn't realise till this point in time, was a program set up for GPs, in fact, to address youth suicide. So how to, when they come in to see them, how to respond, how to identify the signs. There was teachers ones, etc. Now, Keep Yourself Alive was Queen, of course. Do you remember there was a song by Queen, Keep Yourself Alive?
Yeah.
Keep Yourself Alive.
Yeah.
Anyway, I adore Queen. So, and there is a connection with Graham and Queen. And so we got, that song was part of that training. And we didn't know till recently about this. But in any case, I did the training and it gave me a little bit of skills. I thought I knew stuff then, which was like, 1999 back then. So that's quite a long time ago, 20 years ago. And I thought I knew stuff then. Obviously, you never know what you don't know. So I was probably a little ill-equipped, but I was doing training with this program under my belt for youth suicide, for GPs, etc., delivering it. And then while I was up there, I did run into someone who offered me a job at AISRAP, where I am now. So
for people that don't know what AISRAP stands for?
Yeah, Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention.
And that's at Griffith
University, which is where I'm still working today. So I'm coming up to 20 years working there, which is a bit, probably a bit odd for some people to be in the same place. But it's because I guess I've never looked back, because it's a very, very I've got an integrated position really. I have a clinical practice for suicidal people and bereaved, and I have the research component and the education component. So all of these delivering training and tertiary programs complement each other. And it's such a complex phenomenon that but I guess the most important thing from what you've been talking about and what you've shared since you came into our institute on that 2004 time, that was the first person who'd actually came in a capacity of lived experience to really educate and talk about. We see it as education, helping us, clinicians and perhaps people without lived experience. But what I've really appreciated has been the merging of clinical and non-clinical in a way, because, and I say non-clinical when I refer to lived experience, because lived experience was never, the readiness factor for lived experience was not there when I first started AISRAP. So when you kind of came around 2004, that was, I believe, looking back, probably the baby steps towards what eventually, even today, has become now a much greater and more widely appreciated and accepted part of the picture of prevention. And so that's a core part of what we do as well. And we have collaborations with Roses in the Ocean, which was set up by Bronwyn Edwards. She's the CEO who lost her brother to suicide. And that movement is having quite a strong impact in, entering into people like clinicians and lives and academics who haven't really taken time out to appreciate these stories, the narratives that actually are the core of where we need to address prevention, in my view. So that's the journey that's how I got into suicide prevention, if you like. So, yeah, and I've had many suicidal people that unfortunately I've lost a client to suicide, and I through all of my work, I've learned a lot about, what it means to have such internal psychache, if you like, so much pain, unbearable pain, which isn't seen the same as medical pain, clearly. Our services often reflect that, but it's something that which keeps me going, I guess. So my appreciation of lived experience is, in fact, the very thing that keeps you going. For me, that has kept me going in this field. Yeah.
So what do you feel that? I just know, and as I said, the whole component of lived experience from where, when a client comes to work with me and they won't go and see a clinician, and they always say to me, well, why would I go and work with them? They've just got, that letters behind their name. They don't know how I feel. Yeah. And I say to them, listen, peer support, which is what I can offer you, is a beautiful starting point. However, there's stuff that's above my pay grade, because there's emotional wounding, there's emotional trauma. Now, what I can do in my work is a bit like a masseuse. I watch, and I was saying to my husband the other day, I had a client say to me, how do I hear it a lot, people say to me, how do you know that? And it's because I can feel it. And I've been doing this work 24 years, and I think I had a client the other day say, you're an empath healer. And this is a psych student, and I said I didn't really know that. And I started to Google it, and understanding that, so for me, when clients come to talk to me, and it's happened to me a few times when I've had somebody who's vibrating with suicide intent, because I've been suicidal, it's like a frequency. And I don't read minds, I'm not psychic, but I do feel hearts, and I don't mean to sound mung bean or airy-fairy, but when I work with a client, I get them to start to talk about their story, they go into a different channel, because I need to try and get them out of their head and into their heart. Similarly, because I think storytelling is a form of a gentle form of therapeutic healing that was there long before psychiatry and psychology. If you look in tribal cultures, we've got myths and legends which have all the archetypes, the good and evil, whether it's, the fisherman, the hunter, the goddess, the shaman, the doctor, the midwife, there's these stories, and we still pay top dollar to musicians and actors, because we can pay our money knowing that that's Clint Eastwood and Meryl Streep, knowing it's fictitious, And if the storyteller's doing their job, all of our logical brain turns off and we start to what I love to call articulate. We laugh, we cry, we find the hero, the villain. I remember the first time I saw Tom Hanks in Philadelphia. Now, I'm a heterosexual white woman. I just liked Tom Hanks. I really didn't understand what I was even going to watch. But by the end of that movie, I was so moved, educated about AIDS, compassion, empathy. I was just emotionally educated. And so when a client comes to work with me, I get them to start to tell me their stories, because in that place, I want to hear about their childhood. I want to hear about their adolescence, what I like to call their rite of passage, when they were downloading their sexual app between 15 and 25. And then I want to hear about their young adult life. And when I'm working with kids, obviously in adolescence, I just ask them to talk to me about where they are. And we use word pictures. And what happens is, as they start to speak to me, I listen for language and watch energy, and a bit like, I suppose, a poker player that has tells.
Yeah.
And what I do know, and I imagine, a doctor, when somebody walks into their room with swollen glands or a limp or whatever else, it's not psychic. It's just A and B probably means C and D. Let's ask those questions. So when I start to hear certain language and flinching, and it's almost like the eyes are a camera lens. And when people are articulating, there's energy behind it. And when they are hurting, there's armour that happens. And I remember one day in particular, this young girl came to see me, and her father had seen me on Beauty and the Beast, and he was
I remember that.
Yeah, he was a man to do in Brisbane, and he sent her along to see me. She didn't want to come and see me, and this girl had grown up in an affluent home, and I often find, when I'm working in detox units, I often find people that are moneyed, their denial is thicker and it's harder to get through, because enablers or, denial, it's a bit like, I always think of denial like a bandage around a wound. The thicker it is, the harder it is to get to what's going on.
Yeah.
This girl in particular, she sat down and she was vibrating. I could feel she was going to do it that day. And I didn't have to, I think we only spent about 10 or 15 minutes together. And it's a bit like you can hear a baby crying. You can't ignore it. And my whole maternal, anyway, I said, sweetheart, I popped her in my car. I took her to New Farm Clinic.
Yeah.
I rang her father and I started to get the check-in process. Yeah. Anyway, her father roared at me, and was very angry with me and came and got her out. Anyway, he took her to one of their mansions, the North Coast, and I got a phone call from the next morning. She had suicided that night. And I was asked to read a eulogy. And he said to me, how did you know? And I didn't intellectually know, but I could feel it. And I think this is one of the beautiful things about having done this work for a long time, and, we teach what we need to learn. It's heightened my own self-compassion working with so many people. But what I do say to them is, I can only take you so far. I can't go deep into your trauma, because you've got to walk out of this room. Yeah. And I have been to clinicians, and I think the first psychiatrist I worked with that was a lovely man, he went too deep too soon in a session. I started fitting in the stairwell and was put into a psych ward after the session. And he was very apologetic, but he'd gone too deep too quick, and I had to pick the kids up from school, and I couldn't stop the bleeding on the trauma. And I think that's what he then did EMDR, and, we unpacked a fair bit of that trauma. But I think when and anybody watching this that has, feels like that they may be open to a lived experience model, which is what we're doing in this free series, I will say to them, there does come a time. And when they say to me, well, these people don't know what they're doing, they haven't got that lived experience model, I say to them, listen, if you had a brain tumour, you would go to a brain tumour specialist. Now, I know if it was me, I wouldn't give a rat's ass if that brain tumour surgeon didn't have a brain tumour too. Actually, I would prefer he didn't have one. And it doesn't matter if I don't even like him. I want the best in my field when it comes to surgery. Now, emotional surgery is what clinicians do. And there are formulas, and people need to be held very carefully, because when that trauma leaks, if you don't have a clinician, it's like that bleeding can't be stemmed. And people like myself, I would sort of say, I like to hold their hand and get them across the bridge to clinicians like yourself. But I can help them with little splinters, but not that big stuff.
Yeah, look, even some people, perhaps, depending on the type of problem they have, may not ever benefit necessarily from clinical, and perhaps all of the work that they need done is through kind of their peer and lived experience. But it's all very dependent on that one little case, as you say, for that poor darling that you lost, that was lost to suicide. So she obviously had a special level of pain that you were able to connect with, so you knew. Many clinicians may not, or people in service or other people with lived experience may not have picked that up. So it's very individual, a connection that you make that will come from to determine the needs of someone. But look, it's funny that you mentioned this, because the whole clinical, non-clinical thing is a big it's a big issue at the moment in our sector of suicide prevention. I don't think necessarily one is better than the other in that way. I think it's like you're saying, there's like a little pathway of response that can be, depending on the person's presentation or what their story is, can be better or worse off by different degrees of each of those things. So, and it's so individual. This is the problem, I think. It's very difficult to predict someone's journey. But one of the biggest things or biggest challenges for the sector is to know how to ensure the continuity of care between these very both important services and responses. And in fact, I think it's nice that you're able to say, look, you've obviously reflected enough to say, look, here's my capability and competency and what I can deal with. And there's bits and pieces that are more adequately dealt with by perhaps a clinical lens. And in suicidality, because suicide in particular, if we're talking about this particularly, is a behaviour, not a mental illness. So that's
an interesting statement.
Yeah.
Say it again.
Yeah, so suicide, because it is a behaviour, not a mental illness. So it's not a disease as such. I mean, having depression or anxiety or psychosis, bipolar, etc., are problems that are best dealt with from a medical, well, in part, this is arguable even today in the sector, but by a mental illness-based paradigm, which means one would expect that if one of those problems is grounded in the biological underpinnings of our brain in terms of its causation, then it's likely best treated by, to some degree, it doesn't mean other non-clinical mechanisms are not important, but by perhaps pharmacological or other types of, like, there's a lot of new things for PTSD coming out now where we can tell the differences in brain organisation, neural pathways with those with PTSD versus not. So they're trying to look at what are the ways in complementary to psychotherapy or other evidence-based responses that can help in that level and addressing the problem. So, but with suicide, it's usually the outcome, this inner psychiatric ache or psychological pain is the outcome of a number of different phenomena, different contributing factors, never just one. So it makes it more challenging in our sector to best find a way that complements that. And because no single individual, unlike bipolar or schizophrenia or other things where pretty much homogeneously that problem is experienced, right? With suicide, it's very idiosyncratic, and so it's a bit of a challenge. This is why we can't not listen to lived experience, because that individual story will be the dictator. That person is the expert. It is not a theoretical paradigm or whatever that is going to dictate what the best responses are for that person's problem. It is the person's story. So that very narrative is what should direct if it's necessary for clinical or not responses. Many of my clients who present with suicidality often have fluctuating journeys where they're coping really well, and a wellness model very well helps us understand that they're coping, especially when it's very adaptive, is keeping them alive. And it's amazing the strength of these people. And when they're not coping so well and they do become suicidal, they need a rest. They need us to hold that hope that they don't have at the time. And when they come in and see me and they're quite agitated and they'll be pacing and stressed and, not getting any sleep and a whole range of physiological things that they experience, often it is the case that a pharmacological response immediately might be of assistance because they just can't relax and calm from mindfulness and other kind of modalities. And as soon as they do get to that place, you can see the amazing effects of when we do cognitive work. And I know that you've got other terms for this, but for cognitive therapy, things like having to kind of challenge their inner schemas and beliefs, etc. And they're changing automatic thinking and a range of things that we know are evidence-based. I think I've read a lot of your work, and a lot of it is it's a twinship towards these sorts of modalities as well. But these we know the evidence-based to some of these therapies, which are supposedly clinical, but in essence, I think a lot of them share a lot of commonalities and have at their heart for suicide, at least, needing to understand the person's story. And so lived experience should be always at the absolute core of what we do. Wow. So it's a tricky element to it, because in the past, historically, suicide was seen, or right back to antiquity, I guess it was heroic in the martyrdom times, and Donatist Christians kind of behaved in ways that it was kind of glorified. And then, of course, it was happening so much that they had to put a stop to it, of course. Then it became a sin, and then all these moral interpretations kind of changed the way we viewed suicide, and legal interpretations came in where it was seen as a sin. And there's horrific historical influences that have meant that people have been so stigmatised, whether they're people who are bereaved by suicide, who've lost someone to suicide, or whether themselves have been suicidal. It's horrific stigma. And so when Durkheim came in, and you saw in Shakespearean times, Romeo and Juliet, a lot more lessening of this negative treatment towards people who are suicidal. We saw a bit of a shift in blaming the person and treating suicide as a mental illness, and seeing that there are other socio-cultural elements that impact and cause suicide. It's not about the individual being crazy or whatever. And we see that today in our release of statistics right now, and what we have on our database at AISRAP is very much explaining life events, relationship problems, trauma, financial problems, unemployment and quite sudden unemployment, and situational factors and cultural factors that would never have been in the past seen as significant causal factors. So we can't treat that with a pill. But of course, there's obviously people with very severe mental illness that will require that. Yeah.
God, that's interesting to hear. I know back in 2000 when I wrote my first book, and I was, I suppose, seen as a bit of a novelty on shows with, Bert Newton and, Beauty and the Beast. And I remember sitting with beautiful Ida Buttrose and Lisa Wilkinson and Ginny Little and these Carlotta, and these beautiful women just rallied around me to have the conversation. And Stan Zemanek came into me in the green room. I was on that show a few times, but he said to me, "I'm going to come at you, but, I want you to come back at me, because I'm going to be the voice of all those rednecks out there that don't understand anything about addiction and suicide. So, you come for me. I want you to." And he was so gracious and so lovely. And just the whole, because I don't think, coming out as a recovering addict, getting clean and sober, and then talking about childhood trauma, domestic violence, and being a suicidal teen, it was almost an involuntary thing for me. I felt it was so toxic. And if I didn't detox it, I could never. My boys were 7 and 9. They're now men 32 and 30. But I just kind of felt like I wanted it to stop with me. And getting it out through the written word, because the written word gives your heart permission to articulate stuff you can't say yet. And I didn't know I was writing books. I was sitting on my driveway creating a little tribe of finger puppets that, if you look at them, there was my therapist's voice, there was a bit of Freud and Edward de Bono and a lot of the clinical people that I'd been reading that had said stuff that was making sense. But when I'm helping anybody with their story, listening to them as they speak, and I love what you sort of said, you can never know what you don't know. And I also really subscribe to the belief that the golden rule in recovery is that there's no golden rule. There is no one size fits all. And we want to offer the smorgasbord and the options. And it's not that clinical support is better than peer support or whatever else. It just depends on what that person needs when they come in. And what I found for myself, the reason I wrote my first book back in 2000, well, I wasn't writing a book. I was writing to those dimensions of myself that wanted to have a conversation about what courage really was, what love really was, what personal boundaries were, how to laugh and cry again without getting, manic or devastated, and how to, how to thread all that together. And when I'm talking to somebody for the first time, getting back to their story and their dialogue, what I find is, and a bit like a masseuse that finds hot spots, you go in and say, my neck's out, but the masseuse will go, no, it's your lower back, it's referred pain. What I do find is when I listen to people with their stories, there's usually, if you want, hot words or sentences where they flinch or they disconnect or the lump in their throat moves. And it's usually those words that give me a thread back to a wound. And what I found, the person that's with me 24/7 is me. And if I could highlight, which is what I started to do with these 5 characters, and as you know, there was a crippled claw and the helping hand, and I started to identify those phrases and lines that I said that were making me regress and stay in the old story. And what these new characters were doing was helping me. It's that old saying, if you don't own your story owns you. If you own your story, you get to rewrite the ending. You take authorship of your life. And I think, I self-published that little book because back in 1998 when I first wrote it, I self-published it because I was working on helplines and there was only faxes in those days and I was faxing it through. And then there was enough people saying that they wanted it. But I suppose getting back to where you said, that it was more behaviour than a mental illness, I actually think it's a really liberating statement you just said, because being mentally ill, is, again, there are things like mental illness that fall under mental illness that, when clients say to me, what do you think about medication? I say, I'm not qualified to make a judgment, because you need to talk about to a clinician, because if there is mental illness or chemical imbalance with depression, you need support with that. Don't hurt yourself by not getting support. But in saying that, clinical depression is a very serious area, but emotional suppression, which people sometimes call depression, and if I can help them not suppress the shame that's keeping that part of themselves, I always, people say to me, I've got anxiety issues, and I go, well, why are you anxious about anxiety? We all have anxiety, but where's the shame coming from? And that whole detoxing of shame. I'd be really interested, Jacinta, in your thoughts. I remember having lunch with Professor John Saunders, who works with addiction and he's written some amazing books on trauma and addiction. And I got to meet him when he was running the Royal Brisbane Hospital Detox Unit. And when the Howard government was in, he was on the Australian National Council of Drugs. And he was just this amazing man, a bit like yourself, this academic giant that took me for a cuppa and spoke in everyday, took all these concepts and spoke in everyday language. And he was the one that put me in a plane and flew me to Canberra. He was just an amazing man and helped us get federal funding. And he said to me, because there are certain models that look at addiction, for example, and call it a disease. And again, I'm not interested in what's right or wrong. I'm interested in let's have the conversation, because people, I defend your right to make your own decision. But some people say, well, addiction's not a disease. And Prof. Saunders said to me, Cynthia, under World Health, I think it's classified it as a disorder, not a disease. So when you're talking about suicide, you're talking about it being more around the person's story. So disease, disorder, these are all interesting words. What are your thoughts?
It's so interesting, and it's a really, really good question. As you're asking, I'm thinking, oh, what a good question. It's certainly not, here's a little bit of a movement in the last, say, 5 to 6 years. It's not considered a disorder, so you will not find suicide attempt or suicidality, if you like, or self-harm in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders. So that's called the DSM, an American-based thing. The international classification system for mental disorders is what we call the ICD-10 or 11 coming out. So these categorisation where we classify all different types of disorders, it's not in there. However, there was, in the last few years, debate internationally, and Professor Diego De Leo, who you know,
Yes.
who's now our emeritus professor.
I got to put a chapter into his book.
Did you?
Yeah, so he asked me to write a chapter in his book. It was wonderful. I
excellent.
think it was called Turning Points.
Turning Points.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
did. Oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
I was
That was back a few years ago.
touched, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, we went to the book launch,
Yes.
and that's right. That was his first layperson for the community book,
Yes.
outside of being a textbook thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, he very much argued strongly in the international field to keep self-harm, non-suicidal self-injury, it's called NSSI, out of the DSM. They were trying to include it. So it's been put in the back as an additional for future discussion, whatever. He argued for that because suicidality is a behaviour, not a mental illness, meaning that it's a function, it's much more fluctuating. So if you have someone come in at 16 to 18, whatever, with a history of non-suicidal, I mean, who knows when there's intent and when there's not. It has a lot to do with self-disclosure and etc. In any case, and uncovering that intent is already a spurious thing, meaning it's quite difficult to do.
That's a great word, spurious. I love a new
I
word.
borrowed that from the Keep Yourself Alive, Graham Martin thing.
Spurious, I love that.
Spurious.
We were playing a game the other night and I went, Gronk. What's it, Gronk?
I just realised I said Gronk. What's Gronk?
I don't know what it's the word, you know, like if someone's a bit of an idiot, but Gronk, I don't know. We just learned a new word. But spurious, I love that
keep
one.
in mind. Yeah, spurious. I just realised I said that and thought it was, look, that just rolls off my tongue because it means everything that's either double loaded or difficult, it has a double meaning, or it's a bit complicated, and so self-intent, knowing if someone is intending on killing themselves, can change. It's not something that's static and sits in someone's, forefront of their brain. And certainly just because someone might have a plan that they hold there at the side, and some people do, as allowing them to have a way out or a relief, etc. That doesn't mean that they're intending on enacting the plan.
Yes.
So these are a number of different, it's a whole another conversation, but very complex in the field. So Diego was very much arguing that this, for many other reasons as well, but once you diagnose someone with something, it is not a categorical fixed experience usually in regards to suicide. And so this was the first element. There's several others that he argued, but as a disorder, this is what, herein lies the biggest problem. This is the thing we have confronting us with service provision, like emergency departments. When people come with suicidality, where do we put them? How do we treat them? We can't x-ray anything broken, and we can't immediately and shaft them through to get that surgery that they need. So medical departments were set up for disease-based and mental illness-based responses, not for behaviour. So this problem means that, means that people, what do we put on the ICD category? And so there's things such as, I think there is a code for kind of self-harm, but there's other things, situational crisis and a number of other things. So there's never a standardised recording process, for example, with suicidality, because it's so complex, and the phenomenon is interpreted in different ways by different people. And certainly the person at the forefront who may be categorising the behaviour may already have in their paradigm of understanding suicidality a medical model, a very clinical model. And so you'll see depression and self-harm, or you'll see, schizophrenia, bipolar, or PTSD, and these things may be accompanying their suicidality. So that there's often the case, or at least in 40% of the cases in the Queensland Suicide Register, not 90%, as people read, like there's 90% of suicide cases that have a mental illness associated. That is not necessarily the case based on our data. So this means more argument for supporting, non-clinical based responses to the problem. However, when they come in, they certainly can have mental illness associated with the behaviour, but the suicidality and all the evidence is showing us now we need to specifically address that pain and specifically treat the suicidality. The eating disorder, the alcohol, the every other problem, sure, that may need responding to, but when someone's suicidal, we go in straight into what's the thoughts, what is the pain, what is the shame you talk about, okay, the feeling of burden.
Shame will kill you.
Yeah. Shame,
too much of it. It's so toxic.
It's very toxic, and it's very prevalent in one of the protocols. In fact, I'm working on my PhD that myself and Diego designed, is called Screening Tool for Assessing Risk of Suicide, and it's a semi-structured client-centered, very person-centered interview where the person gets to tell their story and their narrative dictates the priority concerns. And one of the elements that, or constructs, I guess, is shame, burdensomeness, feeling a burden.
Absolutely.
These are really key attributes.
Are we doing everybody a favour if I take myself out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So those things that may have been protective factors at one point, I'm not going to ever kill myself because I couldn't do that to my wife and children, etc., become reversed. And it's a very
I'm
paradox.
doing it for them. And I remember being wedged between a wardrobe and a wall. I think I was about 16 months clean and sober, and I found I was coming unravelled because what drugs and alcohol did for me, and they do for many people, is they start out, self-sabotage starts out usually as self-soothing.
Yeah.
It started out as a solution until I hit my use-by date and became a problem. And something you said was really interesting. I was, again, in a conversation with Professor John Saunders. One of his books on addiction medicine had just came out, and it's a clinical text for clinicians, but I was scouring it, and when I read sort of something interesting, I was highlighting it, and I said to him, because I found this stat really interesting. He was saying in his research, 80% of all suicides are alcohol-induced. 80%. That's in his latest book. Of all suicides where alcohol was present.
Yeah, look, I haven't looked at the toxicological reports. We get the toxicological reports for, very sadly, all the people that die by suicide in our register. Definitely, there's a high percentage, I think it's about 60 actually on the register, that have some level of alcohol in their blood.
Okay.
Actually, we've divided it in there. There's 4 or 5 different categories, so of amounts of alcohol. So I think for above 0.05 and above, a certain percentage of people have it in their blood, but doesn't necessarily mean that all of those persons also had a drug and alcohol disorder or alcohol abuse problem.
Okay.
So often people internationally will consume alcohol around the time of their death to try to dull down anaesthetise the pain.
Dutch courage.
And the planning.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, we're not innately wired to do this.
No, you've got to sedate the brain.
You do, and it takes an enormous amount. So I would say, look, definitely drug and alcohol, and for different populations and different age groups, you won't see it as prevalent in the older persons who have the highest rates, 75 plus. So we see different characteristics that I think we need to take into account as well when we're understanding tailoring of our responses. But alcohol certainly does accompany a lot in the 15 to 24 and above age group.
You said something interesting earlier about how some people have suicide, which it's how it operated in my psyche. Suicide for me, even from a little girl, was a friend. And it was that place, and it was with the fairies. It was not, and I remember as a little girl, there were often chemicals in our bin at home, and one was peroxide. And I remember seeing the skull and crossbones and being told it was poison, and I knew that poison could get you dead, and I knew dead meant you didn't have to come back. And I remember, it was pre-school, so 5 and under, drinking. There was a little bit in the bottom of this bottle, and I remember drinking it. I remember having my mouth flushed out with milk and stuff, but I was trying to get dead. And I remember running into traffic, coming home from school, just running. I would be taken to school and then come home and then run into traffic, and cars would stop. But I was trying to get dead because that meant to me it would all stop, because there was 2 male predators in my midst, and my little body couldn't take it, and my psyche couldn't take it, other than laying under the trees. And then at 16, when I OD'd in a toilet block, I'm a recovering alcoholic, but I was sober at 16. Because the sewerage of the trauma of what happened in the past, and I often say to people, suicide when it becomes a friend, when it becomes that ultimate place of peace, which is when I discovered alcohol, suicide kind of stepped back because I could get chemically induced peace. But prior to that, the noise would get so loud, and the toxicity of the childhood would get so loud, that I always think of, the old-fashioned CD player. And it was almost like my mind was like a CD player that was playing this horror story, and nobody taught me how to drive it. I didn't understand that there was a pause, a stop, and an eject, and I could put a whole new CD in. I didn't understand that. So I thought the only solution is get this CD player, pull it out of the wall, and chuck it out the window. but I'm the CD player. I didn't understand that there was a way I could stop that noise. Alcohol bought me some time, and then when I got sober from, I started drinking in early teens. When I got sober at 33, the noise started again. All the sewage started again, and then the suicide, and again being sober, thinking, I am stuffing up my sons. I got clean and sober so I could become an appropriate woman because I felt like I was coming unravelled, and then I found like the trauma was coming back. So I should really do myself a favour and just take myself out, because I'm 16 months sober. I'm worse than I've ever been, and I didn't understand the trauma was leaking through me. And so literally, again, the thought sober was, I best just do everybody a favour. So it's interesting, and for anybody listening to this, just understanding, and this is why I wrote the book, because those finger puppets were like the new CD. When that suicidal crippled claw was just like heavy metal, that heavy metal that sounds like growling monsters. It's kind of what it was like, and I could pause it and stop it, but I had to find something new to put in. Yeah. So the Freud there, all of these, and Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Wordsworth has written, there's some beautiful poetry that I wouldn't really even understand what it meant, but I would read it and cry because it would touch my heart. And I think language, that art of articulation, being able to say lovely words to your heart, to be able to identify that. I remember saying to my therapist, when I started to work with him and he came into the psych ward, and I said, well, I feel like I've got shit on one side of my body and I've got this black tar on the other, and you're telling me you can fix me. Well, I stink for a start and I can't move. I'm emotionally immobilised. And he said, well, shitty things have happened to you, but we can hose that off. Yeah. That's not of you. And he said that tar is your trauma, which has kept you frozen. And he said, and he would use these beautiful word pictures. He said, you've ever taken nail polish remover off? He said, well, I can dissolve this, and we'll just do it gently, and you're going to be tender, but you will, and years later, when people sort of say, if I'm working with soldiers, you don't get over trauma, you don't heal from trauma, that's just not true. You'll always have scar tissue, but you can go on to have a wonderful life. And I think that whole suicide being my friend that could actually save me. I won't sit here and lie. I'm nearly 57 years of age, and I still do have dark times. I have situations happen. I had one just recently where it triggers a trauma that I just didn't see coming, and a part of me thinks, God, it's been years. Where does that come from? But I'm married to a man that actually is an engineer. So I'm really good at giving him, because generally speaking, my trauma doesn't interfere. So he's got all the dialogue. He's got all the language. And probably in our 15 years together, I've had a major traumatic event maybe once a year. So when he comes, he's got the tools. And last time it kind of happened, he says to me, sweetheart, do you need me to touch you? Do you need me to leave you? And if I wince when he touches me, he knows to leave me. But in that place now, it's not about suicide. In that place now, it's about going to get that little girl, and I've got language to get her out. And I often just say to her, stay on the floor for as long as you need to. You're not in trouble. This is going to pass. It's the new language, but it's the shame that I'm a 57-year-old woman that's had years of therapy, and it can still floor me. But I think, I didn't see this coming, but I think the lovely part now is, and I think for people that, have had a lot of pain and trauma, there's that beautiful saying, we must become the adult we needed when we were younger. And so now when I am flawed, and it happened to me, maybe a few months ago, I can, in the absence of my husband being there or a safe person, I can say to her, you just stay where you are. It's going to pass. You're going to be all right. And I think the big thing is, what a gentle voice does is give you hope. That this is going to pass. And I've always said I love hope as an acronym, HOPE, hold on, the pain ends.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it beautiful?
That is beautiful.
And when you, because people suicide because there's no hope. Because that pain, it just feels like How do you pause a CD? How do you shut this thing down? And for most people, it's about, their head or just stopping it all. And the beautiful thing is you can learn that, so...
And it's so lovely that you feel comfortable.
That surprised me. My little heart came out of my throat then.
Yeah, but you feel comfortable. You obviously feel in touch enough with your emotions to do that, and they're not frozen. And these are all obviously things to be able to celebrate. That you have the ability to be in contact with that reflective part of you, because when that is frozen and halted, people do get stuck in very serious positions. So, but I love like the injection of hope. It is, things will get better, but also even those little parts. And I often say to my clients, like the trauma, we've worked through so much stuff. Yes, you can be 57, you can have gone through therapy for 40 years, whatever. But what happens is our sense, it's really about the whole self-actualized journey. And I know, I love this from Carl Rogers, who's that humanistic godfather of psychotherapy. He's very much about like, learning to love yourself means loving every part of yourself. And the bits of the wounded child and the bits and pieces where you have to be the parent to the child and a whole range of things, they're the bits where when we finally don't see that as a flaw in ourselves, that we can actually be comfortable with, be able to feel that pain, be able to do what you've just done now. Like these things, and I often say to them, like, so you'll never be who you can't change yourself to be something else. It's about self-acceptance, and love is about accepting all of those bits about you that have been in suffering and in pain. And because that is never going to go from you. And it's like a jigsaw puzzle. We're all made up of big bits and pieces of our experience. And it's about owning those experiences and in injecting hope in ourselves is possible. We don't even have to always hand over to someone else, although that's obviously a wise thing. And your husband is obviously holding that hope for you sometimes and stuff, and that's very important. But there's other times where we can still be in so much pain and just hold on to at least one thought that, yes, it's not going to be forever. And it would be a boring life if we were perfectly constructed and had nothing else but perfectness and this fluid sense of just being perfect. I don't think it ever exists, to be honest. And if the human character was as honest as it is, I don't know that it would be very difficult to even find a small percentage of people who've never had any flaw inside of them. So, but yeah, I think the important thing is that we turn to help when we need it, and reaching a point where you can feel okay about being raw and letting someone in to do that and being honest about your feelings. That's without knowing it, like right now, this second right now, a baby steps towards every single bit is about building upon who you are. And so just even you're just talking about your experience and then going, oh, I didn't expect this or whatever. That's all really meaningful stuff, because it says that you feel comfortable enough to feel those feelings. I think that's half the battle, because you talk about shame, and a lot of the people that you've worked with that can't and have never been exposed to I guess, a conducive environment with you where they can do that, then they do it. And every step that they do that brings them closer to being accepting of who they are. So I guess, that's part of the goal. And that's part of, I think, why peer support is so incredibly important. Like, you make remarkable milestones, I think, being a peer supporter with people and chopping away at the shame and feeling a burden than any clinician would be able to do. This is why, so recently, this whole move, and we have been trying to get Commonwealth support for this, and we're yet to see with this upcoming election, but there's a whole emphasis being put on non-clinical support services with peer support, the peer workforce, which is kind of well established in mental health, but in suicide, and how the two merge. But in suicide, it's not been as prominent, and getting people to be able to be peers, well trained and appropriate, being able to look after themselves and reach out for support themselves when they need it. But in suicide, it's a very important vehicle to helping reduce that shame and stigma. So people can do this, have this conversation without, holding it in, which just perpetuates over time, So I think it's beautiful that you're able to do that,
Well, I just want to reflect back to you too, and I think part of the reason I was very excited about you coming is a bit like Prof. Saunders, I get these crushes on people that actually are academics but are heart-centred. And for many people that are watching this that have never been to a clinician, I mean, Jacinta is a beautiful example of, a therapist that's heart-centred, and they do exist. And I love that, I love words, and the word therapist is the Latin meaning means attendant to the soul. And I have found it very therapeutic sitting opposite you, because it, again, listening to all this wonderful research that's being done, it just moves me, because I just, I remember when it was so dark and I felt so hopeless, and someone like you would be so scary to talk to. And here I am, moved to tears at the relief that there's all this wonderful work being done, and people that are so scared to even have a conversation or admit to themselves, or that are still... God, I didn't realise I was going to get some healing this morning, but I didn't. It's just so many wonderful people I work with that will never come and see a clinician because of the shame. So what we've done today is introduce, just through your beautiful, gentle energy. And then this is in the backyard of Brisbane. This is Griffith University, Australian Institute for Suicide Prevention. And there are so many like-minded. I mean, you're one of the, head honchos there.
No.
Well, you've only been there 20 years, and, you're leading the way. And, again, people like myself that have had the trauma get scared to sit and talk to someone like you. And I think, we thank you for taking the time to unpack this for me. And, I really get excited that, reality recovery is really where we need to go. So people can sit in the safety of their own homes in their PJs and slippers and realise that whole... I remember my therapist saying, you use the word perfectionism, and I used to say to him, I just want to be normal. And he said, Cynthia, you're a trauma survivor. We can heal you. You'll always have those scar tissues, and... there is no such thing as normal, and that I think that we're all alone together. As you said, we're all flawed, and many therapists, I see them when I'm in the Royal Brisbane Hospital. The therapeutic teams often come in when I'm running a group. They are really grateful for the people like me that used to feel like we were broken or insane or crazy, that share with them data so they can better help us. And it's just it's a lovely union rather than these polarisation. So,
and we're on your side.
Yes,
this is
exactly.
The thing. I think in the past, historically, very much clinicians and that workforce were seen as them and us, but we're really, people usually train authentically to want to help someone. And it's trying to get rid of the stigma and everything that sometimes is within the systems, clearly still today. But I do believe very strongly that is moving. And there's a movement where we're joining together, and having a lived experience workforce, people that can bring their own lived experience into the workforce is half that battle. So
we're on the job.
Nice of you.
All right, well, thank you for your time.
Thank you, gorgeous.
As always, beautiful to see you.
You too.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Need the tissues over here. Thanks, Mitch.
Thank you.